I thought I was being careful. I didn't realize someone was studying me. I used to believe that fear announced itself. I believed it gave you the courtesy of preparation. But fear can be quiet, methodical, and patient. It settles into your daily routine so gently that you do not notice its weight until you realize that everything you do has begun to orbit around it. When I look back now, I can't identify a single moment when it began, which is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. There was no dramatic incident to anchor my memory to. No clear line separating the time before from the time after. At first, it was nothing more than a sensation I couldn't quite explain. A subtle awareness at the base of my neck that felt like pressure rather than panic, as though my body was reacting to something my conscious mind refused to acknowledge. I would turn around, half expecting to catch someone staring, only to find nothing out of place. I dismissed it. My life was quiet, controlled, and predictable in a way that felt safe. I lived alone in a modest apartment, worked a stable job with consistent hours, and kept to routines that rarely changed because familiarity brought me comfort. I went to the same places on the same days, ordered the same groceries, drank the same coffee, and took the same routes because repetition made life feel manageable. If someone had asked me then whether I felt unsafe, I would have said no without hesitation. Nothing had happened. At least, nothing obvious. The changes were subtle enough to be easily explained away if I didn't look too closely. My phone battery began draining faster than usual, which I attributed to a software update. Or aging hardware. My social media notifications showed interactions I didn't clearly remember receiving, which I assumed were glitches or delayed updates. A package appeared at my apartment door that I hadn't ordered, and I convinced myself it must have been delivered to the wrong address and left it untouched in the hallway. Each individual occurrence had a reasonable explanation. But together, they created a pattern I refused to see. The feeling persisted, growing heavier and more difficult to ignore. I found myself changing small behaviors without consciously deciding to do so. Like checking my locks more than once before. Bed, closing my blinds earlier in the evening, and avoiding sitting near windows even during the day. I told myself I was being cautious, not afraid. Then I began noticing him. Not all at once, and not in a way that felt dramatic or confrontational, but in fragments that slowly assembled themselves into something unmistakable. The same man appeared in places where repetition felt statistically unlikely rather than comforting. At the coffee shop near my apartment. At the grocery store across town. At the gym, always positioned far enough away that it felt incidental, always leaving before I did. He never stared at me, which should have been reassuring, but instead felt deliberate. As though he understood the rules of attention well enough to avoid breaking them. If anything, he seemed careful to appear uninterested. The first time our eyes met, the contact lasted less than a second, and he looked away immediately, breaking the connection before it could settle. Instead of relief, I felt a sudden, sharp drop in my stomach. Something about the timing felt rehearsed. I began testing my environment, altering my routines in small but intentional ways to see whether the pattern would dissolve once disrupted. I went to a different coffee shop. He was there. I switched grocery stores entirely and he appeared 2 aisles away. I left the gym early one evening and I noticed him walking toward his car as I reached mine. I never saw him arrive and I never saw him leave. He existed only within my periphery, always ahead of me or just behind, never centered, never confrontational. The discomfort hardened into something more persistent. I stopped listening to music when I walked so I could hear footsteps behind me. I took longer, more convoluted routes home, doubling back on myself and entering stores only to exit through another door. It didn't matter. I started documenting things quietly in my phone's notes app, listing dates, times, and locations. Not because I intended to show anyone, but because writing them down made the experience feel more real and less like a private delusion. I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid of being told I was imagining it. The messages began soon after. They didn't come from unknown numbers or obviously fake accounts, which somehow made them worse. They came from profiles that appeared real and ordinary, interacting in ways that were subtle enough to pass unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. A comment referenced a photo I hadn't shared publicly. A reply mentioned a moment from my day I hadn't written about anywhere. One message casually noted the book I was reading during my lunch break. Another referenced the song playing through my headphones on my walk home, and one mentioned a small stain on my sleeve that I hadn't noticed until I looked down. Nothing threatening. Just observant. I blocked the account, but another appeared the next day. Different name but the same tone. I deleted all of my social media accounts in a moment of quiet panic, convinced that removing myself from digital spaces would sever whatever access he had. Instead, it made me more aware of everything else. Without the noise of notifications and scrolling, the world felt sharper and louder, every sound and reflection demanding my attention. I began sleeping with the lights on. I checked my car for tracking devices after watching videos explaining how easily they could be hidden, even though I found nothing. The absence of evidence didn't comfort me. One night, I returned home and found my apartment door unlocked. I knew, without hesitation, that I had locked it. Nothing inside had been disturbed. No drawers opened, no objects moved, and everything looked exactly as it should have, which frightened me more than any obvious intrusion ever could. Someone had been inside and they had wanted me to know. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light on, watching the door and listening to the building breathe around me. I was hyper-aware of every pipe, every footstep, and every distant voice. I reported it the next morning, and I nodded when management suggested I might have forgotten to lock the door. By then, the name Trenton was already moving toward me. I just didn't know it yet. The most difficult part of realizing someone may be stalking you is not the fear itself, but the relentless doubt that follows it, whispering that every instinct you have might be wrong, and that every unsettling coincidence could be explained away if you were simply more rational. I began treating my life like an experiment, changing variables and observing outcomes, hoping that control would bring clarity. I altered my schedule drastically, taking time off work, leaving my apartment at irregular hours, and visiting unfamiliar places that held no personal significance. He adjusted faster than I did. It was never immediate, never obvious enough to point to conclusively, but within days, the same awareness returned, settling back into place as though it had never left. Sometimes I didn't see him at all. That was worse because his absence forced me to acknowledge that visibility was not required for presence. The messages resumed, this time referencing my changes. There was a comment about the quietness of a park I visited in the middle of the day, a remark about how different my hair looked when I didn't prepare for work, and a casual mention of the rain that began minutes after I left my apartment. I searched my apartment for hidden cameras, checking vents, smoke detectors, and shelves, and finding nothing but feeling increasingly exposed. It felt as though my life was being consumed slowly, cataloged and organized by someone else, each habit noted and stored away. One evening, I noticed a car parked across the street from my building that hadn't been there before. It was unremarkable in every way, which made it impossible to ignore. I lingered near the entrance, pretending to search my bag while watching its reflection in the glass. The engine was off, the windows were dark, and a man sat in the driver's seat. He wasn't watching me. He was just looking straight ahead. When he finally turned his head and our eyes met, he didn't look away. There was no emotion in his expression that I could easily name. No anger or excitement, only recognition, as though he were seeing something familiar and expected. That night I dreamed of being measured and recorded. When I woke up, there was a new message. It came from someone named Trenton. It described details of my behavior with unsettling precision, noting the way I hesitated before unlocking my door, the way I checked my reflection even when alone, and the subtle changes in my breathing when I believed no one was listening. I didn't respond. I didn't block him. Trenton did not want to hurt me. He wanted my awareness. He wanted my fear to be deliberate, and he was willing to wait. Once Trenton named himself, the fear did not spike the way I expected it to, but instead settled into a deeper and more stable shape, as though the uncertainty had been the sharpest edge all along, and certainty, however horrifying, dulled it into something heavier and harder to escape. After that message, I began to understand that nothing about my situation was accidental anymore, including my own reactions. They started feeling increasingly anticipated, as though my fear itself had been factored into his expectations. I became careful in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone else. I stopped lingering anywhere, even in places that used to bring me comfort. Standing still felt like an invitation. I timed my errands precisely, minimizing unnecessary movement. I began avoiding locations that required predictable pauses like waiting areas or checkout lines. Because stillness gave my thoughts too much room to spiral, I did not tell my coworkers what was happening. Although I noticed myself watching their reactions more closely, measuring who seemed observant enough to notice changes in me and who would miss them entirely. I did not tell my friends, because every attempt to rehearse the explanation in my head ended the same way. With me sounding unhinged even to myself, describing a series of events that relied too heavily on feelings and patterns rather than concrete proof. Trenton never crossed into obvious illegality. That was the problem. The messages continued at irregular intervals, never overwhelming me with volume, but never allowing enough silence for relief to take hold. Each one referenced something recent enough to remind me that time itself was no longer a buffer. He mentioned when I stopped going to the gym, though I never said why. He noted that I had started ordering groceries online, even though I never complained publicly about shopping. He commented on the way my posture changed when I walked, the slight forward lean that suggested vigilance rather than ease. I began to understand that he was not simply watching me. He was studying me. That realization hollowed something out inside me, because it meant that even my attempts at self-preservation were being absorbed, processed, and quietly accounted for. It left me feeling as though I could not outthink someone who treated my fear as data. I tried involving authorities, carefully and indirectly at first, but the responses were predictable and polite, offering advice that felt designed for situations far less insidious than mine. I was told that without threats or direct contact, there was little they could do. I left those conversations feeling smaller than when I entered them, burdened by the understanding that responsibility for my safety rested almost entirely on my own shoulders. My apartment no longer felt like shelter. Even when I was alone, I felt observed. Not necessarily through hidden devices, but through knowledge, as though Trenton carried a version of my space in his mind that he could access at will. Sleep became fragmented and shallow. My body woke me at the slightest noise, my thoughts looping endlessly through scenarios I could not resolve. I chose isolation not because it felt safe, but because it felt controllable. Trenton noticed that too. One message arrived after several days of silence, remarking on how quiet my evenings had become and how stillness suited me in a way I might not yet appreciate. I understood then that my isolation was not neutral. It was beneficial to him. That knowledge terrified me more than any direct threat could have. It meant that even doing nothing was a form of participation, and I was losing ground without ever stepping forward. By the time I realized Trenton was no longer merely observing my routines, but actively shaping them, the distinction between influence and control had already blurred enough to make resistance feel abstract rather than actionable. I noticed it first in the choices I no longer considered. I stopped thinking about spontaneous trips, late-night outings, or even small deviations from my adjusted routines. Not because I consciously rejected them, but because they no longer surfaced as options in my mind. My decisions had become reactive rather than generative, each one framed by avoidance rather than desire. Trenton's messages grew more infrequent, but also more precise. It was as though he had learned that scarcity made his presence heavier, forcing me to fill the silence with my own imagination. When he did write, he referenced not just my actions, but my hesitations. He pointed out moments when I lingered, in doorways when I paused before sending messages to others, and when I seemed unsure whether to leave or stay. It was in those moments that I felt most exposed. Hesitation is not something easily observed from a distance unless someone understands its rhythm intimately. I tested him in small, quiet ways. I started making choices that seemed inconsequential on the surface but carried intention beneath them, such as lingering longer than usual in public spaces or abruptly changing direction mid-walk. hoping to create discrepancies between expectation and reality. He adjusted. Not immediately, but inevitably. That inevitability was the most exhausting part, because it suggested a level of patience that felt incompatible with impulse or emotion, replacing them with calculation. I realized then that Trenton did not need proximity to exert pressure. Knowledge was enough. The more he demonstrated his understanding of my internal state, the more my sense of autonomy eroded, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that my inner life was no longer entirely my own. I felt as though my thoughts were being anticipated before I fully formed them, which created a feedback loop of anxiety that made genuine spontaneity nearly impossible. I began to understand that isolation, once again, was serving Trenton's interests more effectively than my own. The pressure intensified when he referenced people in my life, not by name, but by description, demonstrating a familiarity that suggested he had expanded his focus beyond me alone. There was no overt threat, but the implication was unmistakable, reminding me that my vulnerability extended outward, touching anyone connected to me. That realization marked a shift in my fear, transforming it from something personal into something relational, because now the stakes included not just my own safety but the safety of those around me. I felt trapped between silence and exposure, unsure which posed the greater risk. Every attempt to reclaim control felt provisional, easily undone by a single message or appearance. It reinforced the sense that Trenton's influence operated on a level I could not easily disrupt. I began to see my situation not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a sustained campaign of psychological pressure, designed to wear me down gradually, rather than overwhelm me outright. I moved through my days with a constant awareness of being known, cataloged and anticipated, which stripped even mundane activities of their neutrality. Privacy, I realized, was not something that could be restored once it had been thoroughly compromised. By the time I accepted that endurance alone was no longer a viable strategy, the realization did not arrive as panic or revelation, but instead as a dull, heavy understanding that settled into my body with the weight of inevitability. It was as though I had been holding my breath for weeks without noticing and had finally reached the point where oxygen was no longer optional. I had spent so long adapting to Trenton's presence that I failed to recognize when adaptation became accommodation. My days were structured around avoidance and my movements calculated to minimize exposure. My thoughts filtered through the quiet question of whether each choice would be noticed, referenced, or subtly mirrored back to me later. In a way that confirmed I had never truly been alone. The world had not only grown smaller, it had grown narrower. I realized this one morning when I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee I no longer enjoyed, staring at the window without remembering when I had last opened it, because the idea of being visible, even through glass, had become so foreign that it felt irresponsible rather than mundane. That was when I understood that fear had crossed a boundary. It was no longer responding to danger. It was shaping identity. Trenton's messages had become infrequent enough that each one carried disproportionate weight, arriving without warning and lingering long after I closed the screen. Not because of what was said, but because of what was implied through timing and specificity. He referenced moments of indecision rather than action. He commented on pauses and aborted plans, demonstrating a familiarity with my internal negotiations that made it increasingly difficult to convince myself he was merely observing from a distance. It felt as though he was present in the space between my thoughts and my decisions, occupying the gap where intention normally formed. The sense of being known reached a point where privacy no longer felt like something that could be reclaimed, only something that could be managed, rationed, and strategically concealed in fragments too small to be useful. The knowledge that he could surface at any time, with proof of awareness that rendered denial impossible, was sufficient to keep my nervous system locked in a constant state of readiness. I noticed physical changes in myself that I could not ignore. My sleep became shallow and fragmented, leaving me exhausted but unable to rest deeply enough to recover. My appetite dulled, not from stress-induced loss of hunger, but from a persistent low-grade nausea that made food feel unnecessary and burdensome. My body carried tension even during moments of stillness, as though it had learned that relaxation was a liability rather than a reward. People around me began to notice. Concern surfaced in careful ways. I got questions about my availability, my energy, and my absence, but I deflected each one instinctively. I had learned, perhaps too well, that attention could be weaponized, and I was unwilling to expand the circle of people Trenton might observe indirectly. What finally forced me to acknowledge that something had to change was not a message, or a sighting, or even a new intrusion, but the quiet realization that I had stopped imagining a future that did not include him. Every version of my life, no matter how abstract or distant, now contained Trenton as a fixed variable. That was when endurance stopped feeling like resilience and began to feel like surrender. I began thinking in terms of documentation rather than reaction, not because I believed it would immediately lead to intervention, but because I needed a record that existed outside my own mind. I needed something that would remain coherent even if my ability to narrate my experience deteriorated under pressure. I organized my notes carefully, expanding them into timelines that emphasize pattern rather than emotion. I anchored observations to verifiable facts whenever possible and separated interpretation from description in a way that felt clinical and deliberate. I noticed that Trenton's references grew closer to my apartment again, circling back to physical proximity in a way that felt intentional. It was as though he were testing how much territory he could reclaim without provoking an overt response. The tension reached a point where the absence of escalation felt deliberate rather than reassuring, creating the sense that something was being withheld rather than avoided. I understood then that Trenton was not escalating because he did not need to. He had already achieved something far more valuable. He had reshaped my internal landscape. If I continued responding only by minimizing myself, by shrinking further into predictability and silence, I would eventually become so small that there would be nothing left to protect. For the first time since this began, I stopped making decisions solely based on whether he might notice. Instead, I began preparing for the possibility that endurance was not the goal. Survival was. And survival, I was beginning to understand, would require something other than silence. Survival, I was beginning to understand, would require something other than silence. That realization did not feel empowering. It felt like stepping out from behind something I had relied on for too long, only to realize it had never truly protected me. Avoidance had given me the illusion of control, but all it had really done was make me predictable. For weeks I had been reacting, adjusting, and shrinking. Every decision I made had been shaped by the question of whether he would notice. I had been living inside his framework without fully realizing it. So, I stopped asking that question. Instead, I began asking a different one. What would he not expect? The answer was simple, but difficult to act on. He would not expect me to move toward him. The change started quietly. I returned to routines I had abandoned, not cautiously, but with intention. I went back to the same coffee shop, sat near the window I had avoided, and stayed longer than necessary. I walked familiar routes without doubling back. I let myself exist in open, visible ways that I had trained myself to avoid. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the pattern reassembled itself. I saw him again. Not immediately, and not in a way that would have alarmed anyone else. He stood across the street, partially reflected in a storefront window, positioned with the same careful distance he had always maintained. Still easy to overlook. But I wasn't overlooking anything anymore. This time I turned fully toward him. I did not pretend not to notice. I did not look away. For a moment nothing changed. He remained still, his posture neutral, and his attention seemingly unfocused. But something in the stillness felt different, as though it depended on my cooperation to hold its shape. I held his gaze. Not aggressively or dramatically. Just long enough to make it undeniable. Then I took out my phone. Not to check it, but to use it. I raised it slightly and pointed it in his direction. The shift was immediate. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A hesitation. A break in the rhythm I had come to associate with him. He turned away first. Not quickly, but with purpose. As though disengagement had always been part of his design. But not at this moment, not under these conditions. Trenton relied on control, but more specifically, he relied on invisibility. Not physical invisibility, but social invisibility. The ability to exist within the edges of perception without being fixed in place by it. Being seen was not the same as being noticed. And being recorded was something else entirely. I didn't approach him that day. I let him leave, but I didn't return to silence. That night, for the first time since this began, I sent a message. Not a long one. Just a single sentence. I know. It's you. The response did not come immediately. When it did, it was shorter than anything he had sent before. I know. There was no detail. No attempt to reassert control through knowledge. It unsettled me more than I expected, but it also confirmed something I had begun to suspect. His power did not come from what he knew. It came from what I believed he knew. So I started dismantling that belief. Over the next few days, I became deliberate in a new way. I told people small, controlled pieces of what was happening. Not everything, but enough to create witnesses. Enough to ensure that my experience no longer existed only in private. I varied what I shared, when I shared it, and with whom. I paid attention to what, if anything, returned to me through his messages. Very little did. The references became less precise, still observant, but no longer immediate. No longer anchored to moments that felt impossibly current. It was a small change, but it mattered. I spent less time alone in isolated spaces. I stayed longer in places where movement and noise made stillness harder to maintain. I made my routines visible to others in ways that could not be easily tracked without proximity, and I documented everything. Not just privately, but externally. Time-stamped records, reports filed with more detail than before, and conversations. That created a trail beyond my own notes. Trenton's messages became sporadic. Then they stopped. Not abruptly, but gradually, spacing themselves out until the silence between them stretched long enough to feel unfamiliar. I didn't mistake that silence for safety. I understood it for what it was. A withdrawal, whether temporary or permanent. I couldn't know. But the pattern had changed, and not in the direction he had previously controlled. Weeks passed. I still checked my locks. I still noticed reflections. And I still felt the lingering awareness of being observed in moments when I couldn't prove I wasn't. But the difference was that my life was no longer built around that awareness. One evening, I stood in my kitchen again, holding a cup of coffee. The same position I had stood in weeks before, staring at the window I hadn't opened. This time I walked over to it. I hesitated, but not in the same way. Then I unlocked it and pushed it open. Cool air moved into the apartment. The sounds of the street followed, distant and ordinary. I stood there longer than necessary, aware of the visibility, aware of the exposure. Nothing happened. That didn't mean nothing would ever happen again. It didn't mean I had won in any definitive sense. But it meant I had stepped out of the pattern he created. And for the first time since I noticed him, my choices did not feel like responses. They felt like mine. I still think about Trenton sometimes. Not constantly, not in the way I used to, but in the quiet moments where memory surfaces without invitation. What unsettles me now is not the fear he created, but the precision of it. The way he understood exactly how much pressure to apply without crossing a line that would force intervention. I don't know where he is. I don't know if he stopped because I disrupted something essential or because he chose to. And I don't know if I would recognize the beginning if it ever started again. But I know that fear does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it builds itself around you so carefully that you don't realize. You've been living inside it until you decide to step out. And when you do, you understand that leaving it does not erase it. It just means it no longer decides who you are.